Greetings, folks, and welcome to the wonderful world of the Homeric epic. What I'd like to do in this little talk is just give you a bit of background, cultural and historical, and help you get situated as you approach this large, challenging, and absolutely wonderful poem. So in this lecture, I won't be talking about the poem itself, so much as just trying to help you get set up for reading it on your own. Next time out, we'll get into some details about the actual text. Before we start looking at the Greek world, though, I'd like to delve a little bit into a slightly deeper chunk of the past, and talk a little bit about a group of people called the Indo-Europeans. So this will take us back about somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, when, for reasons that we still don't know, a large collection of people who spoke an ancestor to the languages of most European and several Asian countries began to migrate out from their ancestral homelands. So, once upon a time, in a place called Anatolia, which is basically central Turkey, lived a people that scholars now call the Indo-Europeans. These folks seem to have maintained a consistent culture up until about somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, when, for reasons we're not entirely sure of, maybe famine, maybe ambition, maybe population pressure, they began to migrate out. And with them, of course, they took their languages, their religions, mythologies, whichever word you want to use, their social structures, and set about an expansion that would result in what is now the largest language family in the world. That is the Indo-European language family. Now, unfortunately, these folks didn't write things down. They weren't literate. So we don't have any direct records of what their language actually sounded like, and we don't have any direct records of their actual mythologies. But what we do have are remnants in the various cultures that they influenced and whose languages are Indo-European languages that can give us a pretty good idea of what they were all about. Now, as they moved out, of course, their languages changed to the point where they became mutually incomprehensible. And their mythologies also changed, adapting to local conditions, to the natural drift that comes with an oral transmission of culture, and responding as well to the other cultures with which they came in contact. Now, just to give you a quick rundown of the Indo-European cultural sphere, and here, just to be clear, I'm not using this as a racial term. It is strictly a cultural linguistic term. That it has nothing to do with genetics. It has to do with the language one speaks. That's it. That's how I'm using the terms. So bear that in mind as we're going forward. But as I said, as the language group fragmented, as Proto-Indo-European fragmented into other distinct groups, we end up with several linguistic families that are still around today. In the slide you're currently looking at, you'll see a list. There is, for example, the Italic family, which is represented now by the Romance languages, themselves all being descended from Latin, which is an Italic language. So this would be French, Spanish, Portuguese, the various versions of Italian, Provençal, Romanian. A related group is the Celtic group, which once actually covered much of Europe and part of West Asia, but now is relegated to the fringes of the British Isles and Brittany in France. The Celtic languages break down into two groups. On the one hand, you have the languages descended from Irish, so Irish Gaelic, Scots Gaelic, Manx, and on the other side, you have the languages that are related to Welsh, Welsh, Breton, and Cornish. And interestingly, each of these subgroups of the Celtic language family has one outpost on this side of the Atlantic. There's, of course, a Scots Gaelic-speaking community in Cape Breton. And there is, I've recently learned, a Welsh-speaking community in Argentina, of all places. But back to our regularly scheduled talk. Next down, we have the Germanic language group. This one's going to be important to us later on. For one thing, English is a Germanic language. There are three subgroups to the Germanic language family: the East Germanic languages, which are the Gothic languages, and they're extinct; the North Germanic languages, the language of the Norse, so what they would now be are Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, Faroese, and Icelandic; And then there's the West Germanic group, to which English belongs. This group includes, on the High Germanic side, which is another split, Modern German and Yiddish. And on the Low Germanic side, it includes Low German, Dutch, Afrikaans, Frisian, and English. We're going to return to this one later on because, of course, the mythology that forms the background of the Volsunga saga, which we'll be looking at later in the term, is another reflex of Indo-European mythology, which we're also looking at when we look at the Iliad. And just to finish quickly running down the other groups I've got listed here, there's, of course, the Balto-Slavic group, broken down into Baltic and Slavic. On the one hand, Old Prussian and Lithuanian, for example. And on the other hand, Russian, Czech, Polish. Up at the top of the next column, you'll see Hellenic and Armenian. Well, these two also belong to a single group, the Greco-Armenian group. Armenian is a standalone, and Hellenic is split into Greek and Macedonian. Next down, we have the Indo-Iranian group, which again is split into Indic and Iranian. The best known Iranian languages are Farsi, which is the language of Iran, and Urdu, which is one of the languages of Pakistan. The Indic languages are largely descended from Sanskrit, which is the classical language of Hindu mythology and philosophy. So Hindi is the best known example of that one right now. The next two on the list are dead languages. There's Anatolian, which is the language of the Hittites, and Tocharian, which was a language spoken in Western China and is now, as I said, completely extinct. So why did I spend so much time talking about this linguistic and cultural group? Well, as I said, this is going to be useful background not just for the Iliad, but for some of the other things we're doing this year. But also, as I'm sitting here talking into my microphone, getting ready for a teaching year unlike any I've ever had, I find myself thinking about technology. And this is just to take one example, but one of the reasons why the Indo-Europeans were so successful in spreading so quickly, relatively quickly, was that they had a technological edge. And it's amazing how a little thing can change history. What the Indo-Europeans did prior to branching out from Anatolia was they invented spokes. Their chariots had spoked wheels. Now, what's the advantage of spokes? A spoked wheel is stronger and lighter than a wheel made from slats of wood. This meant that their chariots, because they were chariot fighters, were more maneuverable and faster than anything their opposition could mount against them. I bring up the specific instance of chariot fighters because the culture in the Iliad is a culture of chariot fighters. Similarly, the cultures depicted in other great Indo-European epics, the Mahabharata from ancient India, the Tanbahulinga from Ireland, these also depict chariot fighters. So again, when we look at the Iliad, we're looking at a story, a tale, a narrative that has relatives, cousins in many other cultures. But okay, we do need to get to the Greeks, so let's talk a little bit about ancient Greece. The poem is set toward the end of the Greek Bronze Age, in a period known as the Mycenaean period, named after the city of Mycenae, the first Greek city dating from that period to be excavated. Mycenaean culture was based around the city-state. These city-states were self-contained for the most part, each having power over the surrounding agricultural areas, for example, and conflict between them was frequent. They were therefore constantly geared for warfare. And it was through warfare that one got status, reputation, and the highest-ranking people in Mycenaean society were, as you probably might expect, the warrior aristocracy. And it is this warrior aristocracy that the Iliad depicts. And this was also a literate culture. The Mycenaean period extended roughly from about 1550 BC to 1150 BC. And when it ended fairly suddenly. And this brings us around to the Trojan War. And at this point, it's probably good to note that the Greek world at this time was not confined to what we now think of as Greece. It extended further north than modern Greece does. The Greeks had colonized a number of places in the Mediterranean world, and there were several Greek colonies, Greek city-states, on the coast and on the islands on the far side of the Aegean, on the west coast of what's now Turkey. So the Greek world is a pretty sizable place. They had cultural and trading relations with the peoples of the Near and Middle East, of North Africa, and of the entire Mediterranean world. So, as I suggested a few minutes ago, this is a fairly cosmopolitan society. I bring up that cosmopolitan element because it's very easy, very common in our contemporary world to look back at cultures from what seems to us to be the far past and just assume that they are in some sense primitive. In this and in so many other cases, the assumption, the projection of primitiveness onto the culture would be a profound mistake. Intellectually, culturally, this is not a primitive people. And to assume that we have a better understanding of all things than they did, merely because, for example, we can make cell phones and they couldn't, would be, to be blunt, profoundly arrogant. But what about Troy? In the later 19th century, the ruins of the city of Hisarlik, which is located on the west coast of Turkey, was identified as a good candidate for the possible location of Troy. Hisarlik was occupied for about 2,000 years, and as tended to happen to cities at those times, it was frequently ruined and then just built up again over the ruins. So each layer got a little higher than the previous one, and eventually what you ended up with was a city on a mound. Any number of things, of course, could ruin a city: fire, earthquake, being sacked in war, you name it, and you could find some city that met that kind of end. Well, in layers 6 and 7a of Hisarlik, archaeologists found numerous items that fit the physical descriptions of items described in Homer. That is, they provided a concrete reference to the types of things that the poem depicts. I think this is particularly lovely. This work of literature gives such detailed description of physical items that it can be used to identify actual items that are found in a contemporary site. In any case, round about 1250, Hisarlik was ruined in war. It was sacked, and the sacking was complete. It was just erased. It was burnt to the ground. This particular sacking coincides with the Greek historian Herodotus' dating of the Trojan War. So these are all circumstantial details, but together they make a fairly compelling case between the matching descriptions, the dating in Herodotus, and the end to which the city actually came, for this being, if not definitely Troy, a really compelling maybe. And if you take a look at the map in the front page of your textbook, you will see where this city is located. In any case, Troy, or Hisarlik if you prefer, did fall at about the right time for it to coincide with the events told in the Iliad. Not that the Iliad is historical in any way, it's not. It may well have fallen to a coalition of Greek states. This is something else it has in common with the Troy of the Iliad. And interestingly, within a couple of generations of Hisarlik being sacked this time around, Mycenaean society collapsed. That is, Greek culture entered what scholars used to refer to as the Dark Ages, a period during which the city-states had largely collapsed, and the literacy that had largely held the culture together for 400 years was lost. So there's this 400-year gap up until about 750 BC, during which, for the most part, Greek culture goes from being literate to illiterate, and the songs and stories and poems and hymns and all of the other elements that hold the culture together are therefore passed down by word of mouth. This happened, as I said, within about 2 generations of the fall of Hisarlik, and 2 generations is not a long time for a society to go from being vigorous and robust to effectively disappearing. One possible cause that's at least been suggested for the collapse of Mycenaean civilization is that the coalition that ransacked Hisarlik exhausted their resources, exhausted their energies to such an extent that they no longer had the strength to repulse an aggressive invader when one finally showed up in the form of the Dorians, another Greek-speaking people, who invaded from the north, and though less advanced culturally, that is to say they were illiterate as opposed to the Mycenaean Greeks who were literate, had the advantage of momentum on their side. But what Mycenaean culture didn't leave in writing, it left in the memory of people who came after. So the period, the Greek Dark Ages, that spans the gap between the collapse of Mycenaean civilization and the rise of what we now call classical Greek civilization, is the period in which the Homeric epics took shape. And they took shape in a context of a culture looking back to a great age that had been lost and for which there is a deep sense of nostalgia. So when we get to the Homeric epics, we find that they're set in a period called the Heroic Age. That is simply the Age of Heroes. This is a setting common to a lot of epic, most epic that I've encountered actually, and to a great deal of other heroic narrative as well. Generally speaking, heroic ages in epic poetry are typified by, as I mentioned a moment ago, a sense of nostalgia and a sense as well that people now have become less than what they were. More on that in a moment. What we need to talk about now, though, is something called the heroic ethos. That is, the set of ethics, the set of social mores that motivate characters in heroic narrative. And also that are often, at least at their best, emulated by real people who read these or encounter these narratives. And again, this is something that we'll return to over the course of the year in one way or another. The most obvious facet of the heroic ethos is the quest for glory, the drive to attain fame, to have one's name remembered. On its surface, this is, of course, a very egotistical, very selfish endeavor. And perhaps it is. I'm going to take the stance that it's not as superficial as it seems, because I think there is actually something deeply ethical to it. But that ethical element arises from an understanding of human nature that is very different from what many people over the last couple of thousand years, in the West at least, have taken for granted. That is, the quest for fame is a quest for immortality. And here we need to ask what it is that's immortalized, and why does it matter? First, what is it that's being immortalized? To answer this question, we need to have some idea of what the operative conception of the afterlife was for the Homeric Greeks, the pre-Homeric Greeks, and for other cultures that embrace this ethos, whether in the deep past or closer to our own time. Now, the Greeks did have a conception that something of you continued to exist after you died. But this conception was not bound up with ethics, with faith, with belief, or with any sense of reward or punishment post-mortem. That is, the underworld, the Greek underworld, and it has much in common with other underworlds from other mythologies, was a very boring place. It's just a place of listless spirits who literally have no life in them, whose days of action are past. And whether we would say they were good in life or whether we would say they were bad in life, they all go to the same place. There's no definitive distinction between the post-mortem destinations of the good and the post-mortem destinations of the somewhat less good, or the very, very not good. Such distinctions, where they do show up in Greek mythology, are later developments. Even if they tend to show up in older texts, they're generally seen by scholars as interpolations, that is, later additions to a text. So there is no sense, as there is, for example, in Christianity, of having a post-mortem immortality that is the end toward which you are striving. Whether you live a life of achievement and earn your fair fame, or whether you live a life of anonymity and nobody remembers you after you're dead, doesn't matter in the slightest in relation to what happens to you after death. So your immortality, the only immortality you get to have, is the immortality of your name. So the heroic ethos looked at that way is simply the struggle on the one hand, simply to be remembered, but on the other, because the conditions of being remembered depend on what you do. It's an ethos built around the notion of the legacy, of doing something worth remembering. That is, of living a life that others can take as an inspiration. Or even looked at more basically than that, the heroic ethos is one articulation, and I think a particularly beautiful articulation, of the basic human desire to mean something, to do something with the small handful of decades that we actually have above the earth that matters, that affects others in ways that matter to them. And that is one of the ways of looking at meaning. Now, in heroic poetry, of course, the metaphor is warfare. The metaphor is violence. But as with any other mythological text, and here I include all of the major religious books that define the modern religions, a lot needs to be read metaphorically. That is, if you read it just literally, you're reading it wrong. And its best value, its best ability to inform one's life in meaningful ways and in constructive ways comes largely from a metaphoric rather than a strictly literal reading. This isn't saying don't read literally. You always have to start with the literal reading. It's just not a good end point. That is, when we look at the heroic ethos as a metaphor for establishing a legacy, what we're actually looking at is a discourse of human worth. The best thing you can do in life, according to this ethos, is be worthy of being remembered. Now, of course, to be remembered, you need someone to remember you. And this is where poets come in. Poets always play a major role in epic, whether it's classical epic or medieval epic, what have you. Poets are always respected because so many of these tales come out of non-literate cultures. If you're going to be remembered, it's by the poets. They're the ones who are going to remember you. They're the ones who are going to sing your praises. So as we're reading the poem, look at or bear in mind how poetry itself is treated. Bear in mind how the various characters look at the idea of their legacy and see their legacy as tied to their conduct. Different characters view it in different ways, and the ways in which they view the value of a legacy based on deeds are central to the way the poem unfolds. But okay, the last thing I need to talk about for this slide is the notion of honor. This is a poem about honor. Now, it's very difficult to use the word honor non-ironically in a postmodern world, and when I use the word, it is non-ironic. Honor is not the same thing as self-respect. Honor is a recognition. Honor, understood in Homer's society, is the due recognition of your worth. So you behave in a worthy way, and you are honored for that. That's the traditional understanding of what honor is. Now, the poem is also a discourse on what honor actually means, and the word actually means a few different things in the poem. But the starting place is to always bear in mind that honor is central to the heroic ethos, and whether a character has or does not have honor is one of the most important questions. If we want to get more historically specific, though, about the Greek heroic age, it's worth bearing in mind that Hesiod, generally thought to be a contemporary of Homer, and the other sort of foundational poet of ancient Greek tradition, is the one who actually coined the term. Now, Hesiod, whose poems are more explicitly mythological as opposed to Homer's, whose poems are more explicitly heroic, gives an account of the mythic history of the earth, of the cosmos. He describes there being a succession of ages, each a little bit worse than the one before, beginning with, of course, a golden age, where people were better and more virtuous and lived longer and life was easier. And most cultures have some version of that. The motif of things getting worse over time seems to crop up in most cultures, in most mythologies. It's never as good as the old days. In the Indian epic Mahabharata, for example, the main events there, that war, which actually has a lot in common with the Trojan War, are also set at the point of transition between a third and fourth age, again, in declining virtue. So Hesiod isn't even really innovating all that much. The 4 ages of the world seem to be an Indo-European motif, and he's simply recording the Greek version of inherited and, even by his time, very ancient material. And of course, in Abrahamic mythology, the Golden Age is Eden. But what Hesiod also does is, in his succession of gold, silver, bronze, and iron ages, and we're in the Iron Age, we're the worst of the 4, he wedges in a little mini-age between bronze and iron. He calls this the Heroic Age. This age lasted only 4 generations, and it was populated, he says, and this is in his poem Theogony, by half-gods. That is, by demigods, by people who were humanly parented on the one hand and divinely parented on the other hand, and their descendants, of course. And now what he says about these demigods is not only that they lasted for 4 generations, but that they destroyed themselves in war. So they were hyper-heroic, I guess you might say. And the 4 generations that they lasted spanned the time from the stories revolving around Thebes. So, for example, Oedipus Rex. That's set in the first generation of the Heroic Age, to the stories revolving around Troy. So the generation of heroes fighting the Trojan War are the last generation of the Heroic Age. So when we read the Homeric poems, we're reading the end of the Heroic Age, the point at which humanity goes from this heroic past into the mundane everydayness of doofuses like you and me. So there is this sense in the Homeric poems, not just of the kinds of endings that come up in war, specific to particular societies, but there's also a sense that humanity itself is changing, is becoming something other than what it was. And I'll leave it to you to decide whether it's becoming worse or whether it's becoming better. And this brings us around to what a hero actually is. Now, under normal circumstances, in a normal year, I might actually go around the room asking each student to decide or to explain who their greatest hero actually is and why. And then what would happen, so this is where I'm going now, is that we would discuss what the word hero actually means in its original Greek, because of course, to the best of my knowledge, the first time it comes up is in Hesiod, and Hesiod does mean demigod. That is, a hero is a person of mixed human and divine descent, or even watered down just a little bit. A hero is a person of what we might call extra-human capacity, where particularly martial exploits are concerned. So heroism is violent, and this actually brings me around to something that's really difficult to talk about. And we'll be talking about a lot of things that are really difficult to talk about. How do we understand heroism? I'm going to be a curmudgeon because it's kind of my job, and quite frankly, I enjoy it. I'm from Ontario, and the 401, which is the biggest highway in Ontario, is labeled in various places
the highway of heroes, 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 heroes.
As if every soldier who does the goddamn job is a fucking hero. And even that, which is closer to the classical idea of what a hero is than what the most contemporary notion of what a hero is watered down. That is, a hero in the classical conception, in the Greek conception, in the original conception of the word, is someone who has a unique connection to the divine. We're told of Achilles, his most common epithet is godlike Achilles. That's not ironic. So what I want you to think about as you're going through this wonderful poem is, well, 2 things. 1, what is godlike about Achilles? And 2, what does that say about the conception of the divine? And how is it at odds with the conception of the divine that most modern Western people bring to the poem? That is, this is a very alienating poem because it's coming out of an ethos that is foreign. Even though this is one of the most foundational works of literature in the Western world, it embodies an ethos that is foreign to most people in the Western world. I mean, what do most modern people mean by their hero? I could say, fine, my guitar hero is Pete Townsend because I've always loved The Who. And, that's pathetic as far as Homer's concerned. I could say my dad's my hero because he survived 3 bouts of cancer before being killed by the 4th. And by Homer's standards, that's pathetic too. No one will remember my dad. People still talk about Achilles. We're told, many of us, that every life is precious, that we're all treasured little flowers in this beautiful garden of a world. What utter bollocks. But the idea of a heroic age is not unique to the Greeks. Lots of cultures have them. It's that time in the past, as I said before, where people were better, where heroic ideals were more fully embodied. It's the time to which a culture appeals. And by time, I mean mythical time, not real time. It's the time to which a culture appeals for its values, for the things that it most respects. Now, in Germanic culture, it's the period of the migrations, which is the 3rd to 5th centuries AD. And we'll be talking a bit about that when we come to the Volsunga saga. Among the French, it's Charlemagne's wars against the Saracens. If you want to read a really good epic about that, read the Chanson de Roland, where Charlemagne's nephew, Roland, brings up the rear guard against an advancing Saracen army. If you want to read the Welsh version of it, read the romances of King Arthur, which are the first literary love of my life. And if you're curious about whether or not this lives on into the modern world, watch a Western sometime, because the American Old West is the American heroic age. Maybe not every culture has them, but enough do for it to matter. These things have mythic resonance. Now, as for the poem itself, it can sometimes be a little alienating to a modern reader. And much of that alienation is probably attributable to the origin of the poem. The poem originates in a context of oral composition. That is, before it was ever written down, it was composed by memory. It was memorized, sort of. And the techniques of memorizing, of extemporizing poetry, especially of extemporizing narrative poetry, long narrative poetry, in front of an audience, which is what the ancient epic poets did, requires an intense sensitivity to audience response. On the one hand, they need to have an eye on who's being interested in what. How is a particular scene hitting? Are they really enjoying the arming scene, or should we pare it back a bit? Are they really enjoying the battle scene, or should we pare it back a bit? Are they really enjoying the feasting scene, or should we pare it back a bit? Or maybe we should add more, because sometimes more is better. That is, according to the best research that's been done in the last 120 years. Epic poets don't memorize their poems word for word. They memorize the stories. They memorize the plots, they memorize the general lines along which things need to go. And they also have in their mind what's called formulas. And these formulas help them speak in real time in front of real audiences. And when I say real time in front of real audiences, what I mean is that in ancient Greece, in ancient Athens, every year the Iliad was recited, not read, recited, by a rhapsode, by a poet who was also a performance artist. And anyone who has any experience in performance knows you gear your performance not toward the text, but toward the audience, because the audience is what counts. The text is dead. The audience is alive. And the text only lives through the audience. And it's that living audience to which the performer needs to make a connection. Does this mean that the Iliad is in free form? No. What it does mean is that we will never know exactly what the words to the original Iliad are, or even if there is a single thing that we can call an original Iliad. The oldest Iliad manuscript that we have dates to about the 10th century AD. That's about 1800 years after the poem is generally supposed to have achieved something like its current shape. Our oldest manuscript for the Odyssey, by the way, is about 100 years more recent. That is 1900 years after the poem is supposed to have achieved something like its current shape. And this is a challenge dealing with any ancient and medieval text. Authoritative versions are very thin on the ground. So there's a degree of uncertainty with which we just have to start becoming comfortable. So now we just have one final question that I'm going to inflict upon you before I stop talking and let you just go read the poem. And that is, who the hell was Homer? Because unlike with most modern writers, where ancient writers are concerned, we really don't know that much about them. And since the 19th century or so, with the development of newer techniques for textual scholarship, it's really become doubtful who Homer actually was. As I said, there's this 400-year gap between the end of the Mycenaean period and the beginning of the classical period, during which very little was written down, effectively nothing as far as we're concerned. And it's in that window, that 400-year window, roughly the distance between us and Shakespeare, that these poems took shape, these poems being the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the name attached to them is Homer. Fine. What the hell does that mean? Because whoever the poet is working with inherited material. That is, he didn't make it up from scratch. And it was fashionable among scholars for a while to actually suggest that the Iliad and the Odyssey were not composed by the same poet. And even within the Iliad and the Odyssey, they were just tacked together disparate pieces that had no unity except what editors imposed upon them. I don't want to go that far. There is, I would say certainly, a guiding intellect there that unites the poems themselves within themselves and the two poems between them as well. So the prevailing sense in current scholarship that there is a guiding mind, a single guiding mind, behind both of these poems is one that I accept. And I think it's really kind of hard to get around when you start looking at the poetic commonalities between the two poems and the consistencies throughout them. But that said, who is that individual genius? Is it the person who composed the two poems? So this would be fairly early on in the Dark Ages? Is it the person who took this inherited material and shaped it into more or less what we have right now, but still within the oral tradition? Or is it the person who wrote it down? And it seems that they were written down for the first time around 750 BC. We don't know. We just don't know. So I'm going to be using the term Homer because it's convenient. But just so you know, when I say Homer, I'm not referring to a particular person, although I acknowledge, as I said, that these poems almost definitely passed through the unifying mind of a single individual genius. What I say when I mean Homer is the entire Greek poetic tradition coming out of the Greek Dark Ages, the centuries over which these poems, starting with different accounts, different individual tales, different individual stories, songs, what have you, of the heroes of a lost age, brought them together into these foundational masterpieces that we have now. And I do mean both foundational and masterpiece. There were no texts in ancient Greek society that had more prestige than the Homeric epics. And both of them, the Iliad and the Odyssey, have influenced the development of Western society in ways that many people don't even realize because they haven't read them but are still under the influence anyway. Over the next couple of weeks, it will be my profound pleasure to introduce you to the first of these great epics and all of the challenges and all of the poetic beauty and all of the raw, brutal truth about what it means to be a human being from a Homeric point of view. I do hope you enjoy the Iliad. I hope that very much, and I'm looking forward to hearing your own thoughts.